Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Before we delve into our main topics today, a headline of some significance. White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon has been removed from the top policymaking committee of the National Security Council. What's more, the Intelligence Director and the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff will become regular members of what they call the Principals Committee. All this apparently at the insistence of Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who took over as President Trump's national security advisor after General Michael Flynn was fired. Traditionally, political advisors like Bannon are not members of the committee, and Bannon's presence and the absence of certain policymakers brought fears that foreign policy would be over-politicized. Now the CIA director, UN ambassador, and energy secretary will also join this top committee of the Security Council. The White House insists it's not a demotion for Bannon, just the natural evolution of responsibilities. Now on to today's agenda, which involves two hot topics: climate change and the ninth member of the Supreme Court. On the environment, critics lament that in less than 3 months, the Trump administration has set us on a course that will inevitably intensify the calamitous effects of climate change. Is that accurate or an exaggeration? How much? How fast? Can changes in U.S. policy actually affect global warming? And on the High Court, critics claim that if confirmed, Justice Neil Gorsuch will undermine minority, women's, and workers' rights, hamstring government regulations, and more. But in fact, how much difference will he make on the current court? What cases are in the wings? We'll begin with the court and tackle the environment later in our evidence-based politics segment. Though it wasn't a filibuster, it sounded like one as this week's Supreme Court nomination drama began. It was a 15-hour speech by Oregon Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley railing against Judge Gorsuch. Here's how it ended Wednesday morning.
This is an extreme nominee from the far right who doesn't believe in the fundamental vision of we the people and makes decision after decision through tortured, twisted, contrived arguments defined for the powerful over the people, and that is unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. President.
Joining us to discuss the court and how Neil Gorsuch might affect it and the nation, City University of New York Law School professor Ruthann Robson. She's author of Dressing Constitutionally: Hierarchy, Sexuality, and Democracy. And with us as well, Victoria Bassetti, contributor to New York University's Brennan Center for Justice. Among her recent writings, Don't Blame the Democrats for the Gorsuch Filibuster, Blame Gorsuch. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. Professor Robson, there's a new issue this week, some kind of alleged plagiarism charge against Gorsuch. Can you tell us about it?
So plagiarism is something that's close to the heart of every law professor and most students. And there are allegations, and more than allegations really, the passages that in his 2006 book, Neil Gorsuch basically lifted passages, both the passages and the citations, which I think is somewhat interesting and important, and reproduced them as his own without ever citing the original work. And that's a matter of both academic dishonesty, which would be one of the issues, or some people say it could just be sloppiness, which I think would be equally concerning.
So, Professor Bassetti, how serious an issue is this? Are Democrats calling for the hearings to be reopened, or is this a stumbling block or just a black eye?
It's probably just a black eye at this stage of the game. He's been voted out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. There's no turning around at this stage. The vote is probably going to be tomorrow on whether or not he becomes the ninth justice on the Supreme Court. He's just now going to have to carry the baggage of this allegation as he ascends to the court.
We should note that the book in which he allegedly plagiarized was a book that railed against physician-assisted suicide, which is an issue that has come and could come before the Supreme Court and relates to the abortion rights question, right?
Yes, and it had been before the court before he wrote his book. And it really is, it plays into, when we think of these larger issues, both the individual, right, and where's the empathy for individuals, as opposed to larger principles. And for the most part, his empathy quotient, most people say, is pretty on the low side.
And he made a point, I think maybe the most played soundbite from Judge Gorsuch's confirmation hearing was a version of, well, I've ruled for and against men, for and against women, for and against undocumented immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. It's not for me about who the person is, it's about the law. Very different than, say, Justice Sotomayor when she was being confirmed, right?
Yeah, Gorsuch is an extreme version of a textualist. For him, it's about the words. Words matter. The people who may or may not be behind the words, he doesn't really give that much thought to. There is a person-oriented philosophy behind his textualism, which is a kind of a due process notification question. So a person should only be punished by the law when they have clear notice that the law tells them to do this or tells them not to do that. And so when the laws are unclear, he believes they shouldn't impact people. But I would call it almost like an obsessive attention to every little word and its particular meaning really comes through loud and clear, and his consideration of people and the context in which these words are operating possibly a little less clear.
So I would disagree slightly on that and really think, one, someone who has that kind of obsessive detail and attention to words makes the plagiarism problem even more problematic, shall we say. And the other, I find sometimes that there's attention to the words, except when there's not, right? And so that there are long-standing structures, the Levin test in the Establishment Clause, which talks about how courts should look at alleged violations of the Establishment Clause, the McConnell-Douglas test in Title VII, which talks about discrimination, that he's really said, well, sometimes those tests matter and sometimes they really don't, and has kind of called for a lot of tests that have been long-standing in the law. Those are both from the 1970s.
So if you're saying that he shows great attention to detail in the text, except when he doesn't, are you suggesting that he has some kind of agenda?
Well, I think we all have an agenda, so I don't think that that's really outlandish thing to say.
So what is it in his case?
So I think it is this lack of empathy for individuals. I wouldn't say that he's over legalistic because of some of the administrative law cases where he's saying we don't defer to agencies. So I think it is a real conservatism. I think it's originalist in the sense of more the 1930s and really kind of looking to a time before the New Deal, thinking that regulations are bad and don't protect people, that they're regulations and not protections. So those are some of the things that I see as his agenda.
Professor Bassetti, let me follow up on that with you.
Not professor, just to make that clear.
Forgive me.
Yeah.
You're at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. You don't teach law there.
Exactly.
Okay. The area of administrative law, this is not one that's well known to the general public. But Professor Robson just mentioned it, and it relates to how much right agencies in the executive branch have to make rules and regulations, environmental regulations, all kinds of things.
Yeah, everything from the EPA to the FAA to wage laws to overtime laws, environment laws. So virtually the entire administrative state, the way government runs today, in effect. Congress inevitably, when it writes laws, uses words that are not 100% clear. It can't write, complete, perfect laws. And so it passes interpretations and implementation of that laws to the agencies. Now, for, basically the last, since the Depression, since the 1930s, courts have offered what's known as a pretty extreme version of deference to an agency's interpretation of a law. The agency has to be really kind of off the map before a court will step in and say, no, that regulation was wrong. That clean air regulation, wrong. Gorsuch wants to establish a more rigorous court analysis of what agencies do. He wants to take a real harder look at everything they do. And if he does that, if his philosophy about judicial analysis of agency rules goes into effect, the entire administrative state could go into disarray. So many regulations could just be tossed up into the air and be unclear whether or not the agencies, how and whether they might proceed with their regulations.
And so laws would have to be sent back to Congress over and over again to write very specific, detailed instructions to the agencies on how to write regulations?
Exactly. The Congress would have to be much more precise about exactly what it means, what the words mean, how they're supposed to be implemented, how they're supposed to be interpreted. A lot more precision. And as anyone who kind of knows the way Congress works, ambiguity kind of is a lot of what gets stuff done. You leave...
Right, and I think it's not just ambiguity, it's also a matter of expertise, right? And so when Bannon talks about dismantling the administrative state, this is another way to do that. It says people aren't experts, everyone's kind of a generalist, and that should be fine.
Yeah, Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion in a decision. He's on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado, and he wrote a concurring opinion where he really basically questioned the underpinning of the entire interaction between the judiciary and the administrative state. In his dissent, he called the administrative state the behemoth. He called the whole issue the elephant in the room that has to be tackled. So there was a clear, I think, it's one of his clearest expressions of his perspective about the role of regulation and of Congress in the way we order our economy today.
So he really is, you mentioned Steve Bannon, kind of the judicial Steve Bannon, it sounds like. Because when
that wouldn't be unfair, would it?
when Bannon talks about
Right?
his big three agenda items, it's really against trade deals, against the current levels of immigration, and what he calls dismantling the administrative state, which is in pursuit of economic growth, he would argue, to give businesses a fighting chance to grow faster, create more jobs, which creates higher wages. That's what he would argue is the positive purpose of dismantling the administrative state, but it is one of his big three items.
Right.
So Gorsuch is kind of like that.
I would say so.
Yeah, I would say that Gorsuch, at least in that dissent, and it's just a dissent, so it's there's obviously a more to understand about him. It's not the whole argument, but Gorsuch provides the intellectual underpinnings for a judiciary-based dismantling of the administrative state.
Yeah. And where does he fit in among the, if he's confirmed 9 justices, the other 8 who he'd be sitting with? Did they have a similar record to him on the conservative side of the court?
Yeah, so I think he would be closest to Justice Thomas. So really trying to take things back to the 1930s, if not before. These ideas about what's wrong with government, individual rights for corporations and not necessarily for people. So things like that, I think, where he would be. And I think that goes really to what we expect and want from our court. So when I teach, and I have a Thomas opinion, Justice Thomas opinion, students laugh. They just think that he is not a credible person. And I think that really damages the court, because if you have lawyers and law students not thinking the court is credible, then I think that really is
Why
dangerous.
do they laugh at a Thomas opinion more than others? Because they disagree with it?
No, so it's not that they disagree with it. It's more that because they disagree with almost everything because they're law students, but because he will say things like, I think states should be able to declare their own religions. Not the federal government, but that we should be able to have a New York state religion. And there's really virtually no one else that thinks that. And so I think it's so outside the bounds of what people think.
We have to go on to our next segment in a minute, but I want you to get a thought on, considering your book, the gender and sexuality rights record of Justice Gorsuch. Does he have one?
It's pretty, well, it's somewhat slim, but what's there is fairly bleak. And the issues that will be coming before the court, I think he will be most likely to rule against both women and sexual minorities, yes.
I was just going to jump in and say that I think he's actually going to be a particularly consequential justice. He's got a strong, clear philosophy. He is an articulate and persuasive writer, and his personality is sociable. He's got a formal sort of good manners that I think is going to make him a formidable justice on the court in terms of influencing and impacting the future of the court.
He argues that
and he's very young.
A very large percentage, like over 90% of his decisions are unanimous on his Court of Appeals. Does that actually indicate that he's different than other judges in terms of success in building consensus?
I think it is evidence of his persuasiveness, of his ability to consequentially impact the people who are around him through his skills. But I would also say that sort of statistic is fairly common throughout all of the circuit courts.
Thank you both very much for joining us. And now we bring on some additional evidence. Time for Evidence-Based Politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. Environmentalists are up in arms. In one of his first legislative acts, President Trump joined Republicans to repeal the Obama-era stream protection rule, aimed at stopping coal mining companies from dumping debris in Appalachian streams. In another move, Trump ordered the EPA to rewrite President Obama's power plant regulations designed to curb greenhouse gas emissions. The new rules won't appear overnight, but are in process, and further slashing of environmental regulations is expected, along with a possible withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Sounds risky for the planet, but given so many other factors, how much impact will all this actually have, especially on climate change? To break it down, two guests, Columbia University Earth Institute Executive Director Steven Cohen, and via Skype, oceanographer Veerabhadran Ramanathan, Distinguished Professor at the University of California at San Diego. By the way, back in 1975, Dr. Ramanathan discovered that gases other than CO2 also contribute to the greenhouse effect. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Professor Ramanathan, since the Obama acts are being undone by the Trump administration, how effective was President Obama at curbing climate change?
He had a huge impact in curbing climate change, both in terms of what he did domestically and, with the regulations of the gas mileage and restrictions on power plants, the Paris Agreement, in which he played a seminal role by bringing China into the table and having more than 160 nations sign onto a piece of paper declaring climate change is the major problem facing the planet, and we have to do something about it now.
Steven Cohen, when you talk about China, some of the hand-wringing is that the U.S. used to be the leader and was pressuring China to get serious about curbing emissions. Now China is the leader and scolding the United States about curbing emissions. Do you see it that way? And maybe even more important than who's scolding who, without U.S. leadership, do you think that China will seriously abide by the Paris Treaty and really start cutting down on emissions by 2030 like it's supposed to?
I think we have to remember that climate change is also connected to air pollution. If you go to Beijing, you can see the air. And so the Chinese elite that all have to be in Beijing are very interested in transitioning off of coal-fired power plants. So I think that's going to happen. Now, in terms of the competition between the U.S. and China, both are major emitters of greenhouse gases, and both of them need to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And it's not just greenhouse gases that are produced from fossil fuels. Removing mountaintops and deep-sea drilling for oil, those damage ecosystems as well. So fossil fuels are bad getting them out of the ground, they're bad burning. The transition to renewable energy gives you a free source of energy that will only get less expensive as battery technology and other technologies get cheaper. So anybody who's thinking about the next 20, 30 years with half a brain is thinking, I've got to get out of the fossil fuel business into this other business. And the Chinese, in their next 5-year plan, is very explicit about this.
Professor Ramanathan, as a veteran oceanographer, how are the current state of the oceans, by any measure you want to offer, are they actually now, compared to what might have been predicted, say, 20 years ago, as science was getting very serious about global warming as a risk?
I'm an atmospheric scientist, but I work in an oceanographic institution, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, because we can't understand the atmosphere or the oceans without understanding both of them. The seminal data for scientists to realize that this is global warming and it's caused by human activities is the data which showed this warming has penetrated the ocean. The entire ocean is warming. Okay? So the ocean data is key, but the most disturbing thing about the ocean we are finding is that the acidity of the ocean is increasing dramatically, and the oxygen levels in various parts of the oceans are going down. But I want to pick up a theme which your colleague mentioned. In my own view, this whole issue about coal, gas, goes beyond climate change. Fossil fuel combustion alone causes over 3.5 million deaths every year. And US, it can be blamed to more than 140,000 asthma attacks in children. So basically, we have come to this, whether climate change or air pollution, the real issue is human health and damages to property. And if you bring this so-called externalities, as economists call it, there's no question fossil fuels have become outdated. And coal particularly, we have started the transition from coal, just not in the last 10 years, it's been happening the last 3 decades. So all the forces are converging to point out the human well-being depends on us getting rid of ourselves of coal and other fossil fuels.
Right. When you talk about the externalities, that means the impact on the rest of the world of producing whatever the thing is. So all those negative effects from coal. Steven Cohen, I'm really kind of amazed to see President Trump's nostalgia for coal, which played out at that event the other day where he promised those miners that he's going to bring back coal and we're going to have economic growth as a result and a lot of coal jobs. Because from what I understand, the economy of the United States has moved on to the point where if Trump's main goal, and he'll say over and over again, his main goal is economic growth, lots of jobs with good wages. There are many more jobs in the solar industry now than there actually are in the coal mines. Is that accurate?
Yeah, he's in a time warp. He thinks it's 1974. He talks about energy independence and we have a global energy market. So there's really almost nothing that he's saying about the economy that makes any sense in terms of the modern global economy. The jobs in extraction industries are becoming more and more automated. I mean, there's many more jobs in a TV station like this than there are in some of these extractive industries. So he just doesn't seem to understand the 21st century economy, which is increasingly a brain-based economy. There's much more money in software than in hardware. There's much more money in ideas than in things. And I think it's really unfortunate, but hopefully it won't have that huge of an impact.
So, Professor Ramanathan, if there's so much inertia already toward change, if renewables are the future and the market is taking us toward renewables, not just regulation, how much can President Trump, even with the most regressive, wrong-headed policies, if they are wrong-headed, actually hurt the climate and therefore the planet?
That was an excellent opening. Very few know that there are fantastic living laboratories where we are switching from fossil fuels to renewables. 53 cities around the world are already going on a renewable pathway. San Diego, where I live in, already 30% of our electricity is generated by solar. And our mayor is Republican. And California is going to cut down its greenhouse emissions by 80%. This whole argument about it's going to ruin the economy, I'd like to give two counterexamples. Last 10 years, California's greenhouse gas emissions have gone down, while our GDP grew tremendously. And same way in Sweden, their GDP grew by 40%, although their emissions came down by 25%, greenhouse gas emissions, in 15 years. So there is just no data to support that going carbon neutral is going to kill the economy or the jobs. There are counterexamples. But nevertheless, this going back on the previous administration's green policy, particularly on coal plants, the main impact it's going to have is on human health. That's what concerns me. Locally, people are living around it. Its impact on greenhouse gas emissions by CO2 is not that huge.
As you said before, to the conventional pollutants that affect people's lungs. We just have like 45 seconds left.
It's also not going to help the economy of those states. Those states are going to have an old-fashioned, expensive energy system.
The new EPA director, Pruitt, insists that there is such a thing as clean coal. And so today's coal is not, you know, this spewing, filthy horror show that we who live in cities might imagine from the past. Is there a grain of truth in that? We have 20 seconds.
We have enough money, we can do carbon capture and storage, but that's not worth the investment. We should invest in other things.
Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.